wanna be different. I wanna be changed till all of me is gone, and all that remains is a fire so bright the whole world can see that there's something different. So come and be different.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn for this week. We are thrilled that you're here, and I know we have a smaller crowd today, but I believe we'll have a few more that will be joining us as we move on today. But the topic is so good, our speaker is so good, and just can't wait for you to hear from Carl. Just a couple of announcements. Again, just some reminders of what's coming up in Family Resource. Our Merge class for those who are pre-engaged is just around the corner, launching on January 30th. Re-engage, our class for those who are at any stage of marriage, begins on January 28th, and then Financial Peace University also begins that week. And so some great ministries. You can find out all about those at familyresource.info. But I do want to get into our topic today and just kind of let you know what is happening. This is a special weekend for our country. It's Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and it is a weekend that honors really somebody who was an incredible leader in our nation's history. And so many of us can look back to periods of our life where we've experienced our nation not at its best, and when we've experienced some things that perhaps there's some shame that we feel. And many of us have done some of the work that we need to do as it relates to racial reconciliation. One of the things I love about our speaker today is that he has just lived out what it means to be a reconciling leader in our community. Carl Nelson has been here in the Twin Cities now for almost 20 years as the head of an organization called Transform Minnesota, which Wooddale Church proudly partners with. Transform Minnesota is the local arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, and for probably close to 50 years here in the Twin Cities, 60 years in the Twin Cities, has been bringing churches together who are like-minded theologically to make a greater impact for the gospel. The parent organization of Transform Minnesota oversees a number of other ministries in our backyard that many of you have heard of and maybe don't know are part of Transform, like Arrive Ministries or Damascus Way or New Life Family Services. And those ministries in and of themselves are significant. And we're going to have an opportunity on Sunday, if you attend Wooddale, to hear about the impact that New Life Family Services is making in our own backyard. And so this is a great organization. Carl is a great leader. He's somebody who pastors around the Twin Cities. We jokingly refer to him as our Pope because he is somebody that not only leads initiatives for the church to kind of come together on, but he's somebody who is just a prayer warrior for pastors. He's somebody that when I pastored a smaller church in Woodbury, Minnesota, took the time to come up to Woodbury and visit our little church of less than 200 people and take time with the small church pastor and check in on me and pray for our staff and pray for our team. And he does the same thing with pastors at the largest churches around the Twin Cities. It doesn't matter. He does that in the hood, and he does that in the suburbs, and he does that all around. And one of his passions is that our church leaders across ethnic lines would get to know each other. Carl is married. He's got an incredible family. He has chosen to live in North Minneapolis, and I love that. And he's somebody who not only has chosen to live in North Minneapolis, but did that as somebody who didn't grow up in the city. And I don't want to steal all of his thunder here. So would you welcome Carl Nelson as he comes up to speak?
All right, well, it's really good to be here today. Thank you, Brian, for your welcome and introduction. And it's great to join you for this Lunch and Learn here with you today. So, I see some faces that I recognize, so thanks for coming and joining with us. As Brian mentioned, Transform Minnesota is an organization that's been around since 1965, and really our passion is about connecting Christian leaders and coming together and equipping those leaders, but ultimately we want to see lives transformed across Minnesota, and that hence is how our name has come about. He mentioned that we're the umbrella of three other ministry organizations: Arrive Ministries, which serves the refugee and immigrant community. Damascus Way is a halfway house for men who are coming out of prison, and have programs here in the Metro in Rochester and New Life Family Services. But the way that we at Transform Minnesota go about our work is really kind of this principle of saying we want to be a place where we gather networks of Christian leaders and we engage complex issues from a biblical perspective. So the theme today that we set up is how do we build bridges towards racial reconciliation? And the conversations and the issue around race dominate so many things in our society today, and it's a complex issue. And so our approach as we think about this, as we talk about how do we build bridges towards racial reconciliation, is that we needed to be guided by our faith, we needed to be guided by the Bible. And so just like our motto says, to engage these complex issues with biblical perspective, that's how we have chosen to try to frame the way that we approach. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to kind of maybe break up into two parts the stuff that I want to share with you a little bit today. I want to tell you the story of a group of churches here in the Twin Cities that have been kind of on this journey together and how that journey evolved and some of the things that have come out of that. And then the second part that I want to share with you is to say, what are some principles that help guide us? What is a framework that we can use as we try to think about how do we in our own lives build bridges towards racial reconciliation? So let me jump into it and start and telling you about this story of churches in the Twin Cities that have come together and tell you the story of Sankofa. So some of you may have heard of this word before, but Sankofa is a word that is from a tribal language in Ghana. It's actually the Akan people group in Ghana, and the word kind of in its most literal sense means to go back and get it, right? To go back and get it is the meaning of this idea of Sankofa. Now, where we have used that in our journey of how do we build bridges towards reconciliation is to say, there's a lot of things that we need to go back at our past and go back into our history and try and understand as we think about the situation, the context that we live in today, and we look around us and we see disparities, or we wonder why certain things are the way they are, or maybe we don't wonder why the things are the way they are. The reality is that the history of our society and the history of our country has shaped us, and many times we get detached from that. We don't know it or we forget about it. Sometimes people intentionally block it out because of the pain of it, and yet that history still shapes and affects us today. And so Sankofa is the idea of saying, let's go back and let's try and understand the past and how it has shaped us today. So in particular, what we have done in the Twin Cities going back to 2017, it began with a group of pastors, about 30 black and white pastors from churches across the Twin Cities came together and said, we want to go on a Sankofa trip together. And what we did is we took them on a 4-day journey. We flew down to Atlanta. We got on a bus together, and then we went to Birmingham, we went to Montgomery, we went to Selma, walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge together, went to Jackson, Mississippi, spent time with Dr. John Perkins, if you know that name, kind of one of the spiritual fathers of the Christian civil rights movement, up to Memphis, and then back to Atlanta. We did all of that in 4 days. And we were on a bus together, and when we weren't stopping at a place, we were watching documentaries and films on the bus. We were having conversation together. Some of the places, this photo right here that you see is our group, and the first year that we went, standing on the steps of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. One of the other places we went to is the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, just an hour down the road. If any of you are, if you make a road trip, instead of flying to Florida, if you make a road trip and drive down to Florida, go through Montgomery and stop. There's both an excellent museum and this memorial here that you can see. But the National Lynching Memorial is a place where it's trying to memorialize and bring to memory the names of the more than 4,000 people that were lynched in the United States during the Reconstruction era. Oftentimes, almost all of those extrajudicial, meaning many times people were arrested for something, they were held in jail, a mob would break into a jail and take them out, and they would be lynched without trial, just in mob violence. And so when you look at the picture there, what you're seeing is each of those kind of metal squares has the name of a county on there, and etched on the front of that would be the names and dates of people that historians have now gone back and uncovered and documented that they were killed in that county by lynching. So this is one of the places that we have gone to. Another that we went to here is the second year that we took this group. Is in 2018, and that group is gathered. We're at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. This is the church where Dr. Martin Luther King kind of began his ministry, one of the first pastorates that he had, where as a young man he helped organize and lead the Montgomery bus boycott. And so he was kind of an unknown person at the time, but was asked to step up as a local pastor and lead that. So there we are, standing at the front of, surrounding the pulpit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And so this has been, we've taken 5 different groups over the years. So the last group that we took was in 2023. All told, there's been well over 100 leaders from across the Twin Cities, from churches everywhere, that have gone on this journey together. And part of it is saying, how do we look back at our past? How do we build relationships? How do we tell our stories to each other? One of the things that is true about this is, as we're on this journey, there's a lot of things that we are unpacking and uncovering. And so for, going back to this photo of the National Lynching Memorial, many people have suppressed memories or information about this because it's just so painful. And when you read some of the stories and some of the placards where they tell some of the stories of people, it's heartbreaking. And so I, as a white person going on this trip, for me, the complex feelings I'm trying to wrestle with is how do I respond to this, even though I don't have roots or ties to this part of the country, yet this is my country, right? I'm a son of this country, and this is our history, and there's a pain as you look at something like this while you are walking through this memorial with an African-American brother in Christ, another pastor that you're spending 4 days with and you're sharing life with. And many times for them, the story or the experience that they're wrestling through is that while they maybe have heard general stories, especially those who maybe have grandparents or parents who have migrated from southern towns and are now here, they've maybe heard general stories and ideas about some of the things that happened, but when we go out through these museums and go on this journey and you kind of dig into the deep history, I've often seen many of them just kind of in tears and kind of crying and saying, I had no idea. I had no idea the journey, the pain, the suffering that my ancestors, grandparents, probably grandparents or great-grandparents that maybe I knew or interacted with, but they just kept it quiet and they never told it. And oftentimes their resolve is, while they're still alive, I need to go back and I need to get that story. I need to document some of that. So I'd love to show you just a quick little video here that shares, gives you a glimpse of what this journey is like.
We shall overcome. One more time. We shall overcome. I hope to take back to my community a renewed sense to make sure that people never forget, but also don't remain silent. Act, do something.
I hope that I can be an influencer for good and for God in the same way to my friends and connections. I hope from the connections I've made on this trip that we will really formulate something to do together to bring black and white together, to just meet one another and have relationship.
We have a
a huge calling and mission towards racial reconciliation, to be a multi-tribal church. And so I just want to take what I've learned from this trip and bring it back and to help guide my church family through the racial reconciliation process.
Today, we as followers of Jesus Christ need to understand that it's good and healthy to critique the church, and we critique the church because we love the church, because we love Jesus' body. And so we want it to be true and right and strong and healthy.
To weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn. It takes ideas that are abstract, makes them very personal, very real, and I think it thrusts them into our souls in ways that allow us to have an empathy, to grow courage, and to have a vision for image bearers coming together and celebrating their dignity given by God.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
And what is that energy we're feeling as a camaraderie, as a brotherhood, sisterhood, that's going to really change the dynamic of the Christian movement in Minnesota, with hands down, no question about that. I think that we have to continue our conversation, but I think that certainly these last few days has created a bonding and an immersion of understanding what the history was and how we can maybe redress those things when we get home.
Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
So you can see while it's an exhausting journey to be on, it's also a lot of fun. And I've had the privilege of being on helping to lead and facilitate five of those right now. But so what's been some of the results of this process where leaders kind of look back and try and understand our roots and look back at our history and how did we get here, as well as spending time and building relationship together? Some of the things that we've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years since we took that first trip are that we've watched a number of church partnerships emerge, especially between either black and white congregations or between urban and suburban congregations intentionally connecting with each other. A couple of them have been around a prayer movement. 3 churches in North Minneapolis and a suburban church regularly meeting for prayer walking in neighborhoods where there's been violence over the summertime, holding a barbecue on hotspot corners on a Friday night in the summer, doing things like that. Churches that have come together and done community outreach, partnering with a school. So rather than just going and helping a church in an urban community, saying, how about if the two of us team up together and we will together go help the school that's in your neighborhood and do that together. One of the things that came about because of this is an initiative called the One Fund. And when COVID, if you remember back to when COVID started, and we went into a shutdown and everybody stayed at home and churches had to really quickly figure out how do we meet online, several of the pastors who had been on the Sankofa trip together, in talking to each other, it became really apparent quickly that a number of the African American churches were really struggling financially just because of their pattern and their culture of how their giving was done. They weren't set up for online giving, and a couple of the pastors realized, oh my goodness, my friend who's over there ministering in this place is on the verge of not being able to pay the electrical bills, and they said, could we do something together? Like, we need to step in and help them. And so they came up with the idea of the One Fund to say, let's create a fund. We set it up at the National Christian Foundation, and people gave some money so that we could give some emergency assistance to churches. If you remember back to those days, maybe you don't want to remember back to those days, but go with me here for a second. If you remember back to those days, they were giving out these stimulus checks, right? So the first one was $1,200. And a few of us were on a phone call in April at one point saying, boy, could we, how could we come up with some money to do this? And one of them said, my church is still paying me. What if we committed to give our stimulus check to this one fund so we could help some others? And what happened was the first 5 gifts to the one fund were $1,200 each. And within a week, we said, I think we could raise $25,000. And within 2 weeks, we had that. And then we said, well, boy, maybe we need to set our sights a little bit higher. What happened is that, if you remember then on Memorial Day weekend that year, George Floyd was killed, and there was an uprising. And very quickly, people said, we want to do something. And so the One Fund became this vehicle where it began to provide emergency support, particularly to Black-led ministries that were in these communities that were impacted by that. And what happened is in the course of a year, nearly $1 million was given to the One Fund and distributed to Black-led churches and ministries. And almost all of that came from churches that have been involved and been on the Sankofa journey in the past. Churches that said, we want to give either directly from churches or people in their congregations. And so it's often untold stories like this that are under the surface that have been the result of the Sankofa journey. We've had some cohorts called One Race cohorts with a partner ministry. We've had several of those where people, black and white pastors, have spent a year studying together and learning about each other's ministry and context. And we've had some worship gatherings over time. In fact, more recently, last summer, on Juneteenth, a holiday to kind of celebrate the end of slavery in America, celebrated on Juneteenth. We had a worship gathering in South Minneapolis. And this weekend, on Sunday night, 6 p.m., there's another group, another worship gathering. Many of these churches have connected over the years through the Sankofa journey. And so there's been this community of churches and people that have been working to build bridges through relationship, through spending time together, through digging back and understanding our history and our roots, and doing relationship and coming together and worshiping Jesus as the foundation for how do we move forward and how do we move towards reconciliation. I'll do Q&A a little bit later, but I just kind of want to shift and maybe pause in that storyline and shift for a little bit to say, so how do the rest of us do this? Like, how can we incorporate this into our own lives, or how can we, maybe with other people around us, like how can we help all be on this journey together? I think as Christians, we know that the truth will set us free, right? So understanding and say, okay, what is really going on? We know that God is a God of forgiveness. He's willing to forgive us and to help us rebuild and restore. And so here's a quick question, and shout it out, and I'll repeat it for those watching online. When you think about the 1950s, the 1960s, think about 1950s, 1960s. What kind of images, what kind of ideas, what kind of impressions come to mind? Someone shout something out. 1950s, 1960s. What? And I'm not saying that you have memories of that, right? I'm just saying maybe you heard it from your parents or grandparents. What comes to mind when you think 1950s, 1960s? Segregation? Marches? Civil unrest? Okay. Demonstrations? All of those are part of especially the 1960s. Also, if you think back through popular culture, probably this is a little bit more the 1950s, the I Love Lucy era, going a little bit earlier to the 30s and 40s. The Andy Griffith Show, anybody here raise a hand, watch the Andy? Yeah, there we go. When my kids were young, a summertime thing that they loved to do on a summertime night is we'd get a bowl of ice cream and we'd watch an Andy Griffith Show together. And, that was a fun pastime. So we look back at the past, and we say marches, protests, but we also think sometimes of these more simpler times that existed as well. I've seen a magazine out there called The Good Old Days, right? Okay, someone knows it, right? You've seen that magazine, The Good Old Days, and, I page through it when I see it, and I look at it, I'm like, okay, this is a much simpler time. But was it reality? right? What was the reality? So when we think back and we look back for a little bit, so this is our group on the steps of 16th Street Baptist Church and one of the trips that we took. But the picture on the left is that same church, 16th Street Baptist Church, in September 1963. So if you know the story there, some men had set off dynamite underneath the steps, the back entry to the steps, that exploded on a Sunday morning as they were between Sunday school and the church service. These 4 girls were in the ladies' restroom, which was right by the wall, and when the bomb exploded, it left a hole in the brick wall of the building. They were killed. One of the girls was so badly injured that they could only identify her by a ring that was on her hand. And so, in some ways, this is part of our history that has happened. Another place, and this is one of the places we've gone on our journey, this is inside the home of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi. So Medgar Evers in 1963, that's a bullet hole that you see in that picture on the wall inside his house. Medgar Evers had been working for the NAACP. He lived in this neighborhood with his wife and his 2 kids. He had been out working in the summertime to register people to vote. As he came home one evening, pulled into his driveway, got out of his car. Some people in some bushes across the street with a deer rifle shot him, and the bullet passed through him, killing him, went through the wall of the outside and into the inside of their house. And that was on June 12th, 1963. And that picture that you see there is our group of pastors as we were touring through the house, just kind of learning the story and coming to grips with this is the history that's happened. I'll say this for myself, that when I have, as a young man, I think thinking about and trying to wrestle with how do I understand particularly the evil of slavery, this was kind of maybe how I conceived of our timeline in the United States, right? It was a very simplistic timeline that kind of saw a colonial era. We saw the Declaration of Independence, the beginning of the United States, recognized that there was slavery that went on during that period, but the sense that you had the Civil War and slavery ends. And frankly, I had this big question mark in my mind of that period between the ending of the Civil War and then the 1960s, when we think of the civil rights laws that were passed and the reforms that were made. There was this big kind of just blank spot of not being really aware of what went on. And I think today I would say, I think a more full understanding, as I've come to think about it, is like, okay, so you have the era of discovery beginning in 1492 when Columbus stumbles across the United States. But really, 1619 is an important year because in Virginia colony, that was the first year that some enslaved, actually some Africans who had been captured from Africa on a boat landed, had been pirated, and the pirates took the cargo, including the African slaves, from the ship and then landed in Virginia and sold them into slavery in Virginia. And so that's 1619, really when you have the beginning of the first enslaved Africans here in the U.S. And so you have slavery continuing throughout that whole time. Of course, you have the Revolution, but the Constitution is an important piece because in that time, you have the 3/5 Compromise that's written into the Constitution of the United States. So then you get to the Civil War, and there's this sliver of hope for about 10 years, the era of Reconstruction, which ends in 1877. And you go back into this period of segregation where states begin to pass state laws really regulating the separation and segregation and discrimination of African Americans, the Jim Crow era in the South, and you then come to the civil rights ending. The point of this, when you compare kind of what for me has been a more simplistic view and timeline of American history with maybe a more complex timeline, is you begin to realize that of the more than 500 years of kind of Western and European presence in what is now the United States, nearly 350 of that has been dominated by slavery and segregation. And so something that has been so pervasive and so deeply woven into our culture and our fabric and our history is going to take a long time to unwind all of those tendrils. And so we all want to, jump ahead and move forward quickly, but many times we in doing so, we don't fully understand all the threads, all the tendrils that are still kind of hanging on to us. Which brings me to this point. The idea of history versus nostalgia. History versus nostalgia. So the question is, do we remember the past as we wish it were, or do we remember it as it actually was? And many of the things that when I just asked about how we remember the 1950s and 60s, if we think about it or we think further back, many times we want to remember the past in a nostalgic way. We want to remember it as we wish it were this way. And yet, a lot of times history is more confronting than that, and that's what actually can lead us to freedom. So here's a framework that we have kind of followed and used at Transform Minnesota for moving forward. We call it know the story, own the story, change the story. Know, own, change. Know the story, own the story, change the story. And it comes from a group called the One Race Movement, which is based in Atlanta, led by Josh Clemens and another group of people that we've worked with there. And so the idea of know the story is to say, how do we look back, as I've been talking about here, how do we look back at our history and recognize things that have actually happened in our past? So here's a few things. How many of you know the story of what happened in Duluth on June 15th, 1920? So this is an image from a lynching, a lynching of 3 men that happened on June 15th in Duluth, 1920. It was witnessed and attended by multiple thousands of people. Some people put the estimate as high as 10,000 people gathered in kind of a mob riot in Duluth. These 3 men were working for a circus that was traveling through town. And what had happened is a young woman and her boyfriend had been out past hours, and they came home, and she was trying to cover up and hide the fact that they shouldn't have been out there. So she made up a story that she'd been accosted, and didn't necessarily say black men, but it made up a story that she'd been accosted. And her father goes to the police, and they arrest a bunch of people who were with the circus because they just, they were suspicious, they thought. Why not them? And they arrested a bunch of people, and 3 of those, Elias, Elmer, and Isaac, were African Americans. They broke into the jail and took them out, and they lynched them there in Duluth. This is 1920. I've intentionally blocked out the image of their bodies that is hanging there from a light street, because I'm not going to confront you with that. But you can go to Duluth and you can see a brass marker where it retells this story. But here's how local newspapers talked about it. So Ely, the Ely miner, while the thing was wrong in principle, it was most effective. Just think about those words. And those who were put out of their criminal existence by the mob will not assault any young more girl. Or go from the far northern part of the state and go down to south central Minnesota, the Mankato Daily Free Press. Mad dogs are shot dead without ceremony. Beasts in human shape are entitled to but scant consideration. I put these up here just so you kind of you recognize and you understand this was the sentiment. This was in our Minnesota, right? We sometimes separate ourselves in Minnesota from the Jim Crow sentiment and attitudes that we see in the South. Now, the sad fact of the story is within a few days after this, the young girl who had kind of made up this accusation as a way of getting out of having been out with her boyfriend when she wasn't supposed to, she actually kind of privately recanted that, and the recanting never came until much later. And so these men had absolutely nothing to do with this. There was a shred of evidence about this at all. And yet this is part of part of what happened in our own history here in Minnesota. How many of you are familiar with racial covenants? Racial covenants? All right, a few of you. So the idea of a racial covenant is that in deeds was written a clause that would prohibit the sale of the property to certain people. And basically it was written so that it couldn't be sold to anybody who wasn't white. So I was doing a seminar like this in my church a number of years ago, and was talking about this, and a lady who's about the age of my parents came up to me, and she's like, I have the deed to the house I lived in that my parents built. They bought the land in 1948, and now I live there, and we've built a house, and I have the deed. She's like, there's a racial covenant in my deed. Can I bring it to you and show it? So she brought it to me, and written right there in the deed of the land where she currently lives is this phrase, limiting that the grantee cannot sell or rent said real estate or any part thereof to any person not belonging to the Caucasian race. This was a pretty common and frequent practice throughout the United States, and it was not only African Americans. It was written against Jewish people, against Turks, against essentially anybody who was not white. If you want to learn more about it, is kind of on this idea of how do we know the story of what really went on. Google a project called Mapping Prejudice. You can go online, Google Mapping Prejudice. It will take you to this website that's hosted at the U of M. And what you will see there is you can actually, look on the map and you can zoom in to specific parcels, specific property. I've looked at my home in North Minneapolis, zoomed right in on the lot. And it will tell you whether there was originally a racial covenant, a racially restricted deed on that parcel. And what you'll find is that there were thousands, they've discovered at least 30,000 parcels of those in Minneapolis, in St. Louis Park, in Edina, in Robbinsdale, in Golden Valley, that was in existence. And it was really only outlawed by Supreme Court rulings and the Fair Housing Law in the 1960s. Another way that you can kind of know the story is through some books. This is Just Mercy. There was a film by the same name written by Brian Stevenson, one that I would recommend to you. Another one that I would tell you about is one that I just finished reading. In fact, Brian, I know, has got a couple copies here that he might, I don't know how you're going to give them away a little bit later. But so this is a really fascinating, if you like biography, if you like reading the story of people, The Warmth of Other Suns is from a poetic quote. That's where the title comes from. And it's really the story of African Americans, the great migration of African Americans really fleeing southern towns and counties and states and moving to the northern cities and to California. And what Isabel Wilkerson, who writes this, she interviewed over 1,200 people who had made that migration in their lifetime. So she started this research in the 90s, interviewed over 1,200 people, and what she does is she basically follows 3 of them in kind of a biography format. It's I would highly, highly recommend this. If you want to understand just some of the community formation, some of the journey, some of the story, I would highly recommend this book. So as we move on in this journey of know the story, own the story, change the story, the next part is to say, okay, how do we own the story? What does that mean? And this is a really fraught part of the journey, which is to say, what does it look like for me to own my place in this? And I'll just say that as Christians, I think there's a way. I think there's particularly ways that we as Christians can navigate through this with Scripture. The question that we have to wrestle is, what's the difference between guilt and responsibility? And I would say that there's a difference, right? I maybe am not guilty of committing certain acts, but as a product and a son of this country, I have a certain responsibility. If we, and I'll just jump through these a little bit. A couple scriptures. If you go back to the Old Testament, you look at Nehemiah and captivity. Nehemiah talks and he makes this prayer of confession, confessing their sins and the sins of their ancestors. And it continues on And he says, our ancestors did not follow your law. At the end, they did not serve you or turn from their evil ways. Around the same time period, you have Daniel, who is kind of writing and making a similar confession, and kind of collectively on behalf of the people saying, we have sinned. And the idea is that they recognize that Daniel and Nehemiah were living in captivity, not as a result of their sins, but of their ancestors' sins. But they were living in the consequences of that and had to figure out how to deal with it. And so when we think about owning the story, here's how I tend to frame it, is to say that, there's three things we can say. We can say that was wrong and we won't repeat it. Right? That was wrong, we won't repeat it. Two, we are going to go in a different direction. That was wrong, we're going to go this way instead. And then the third commitment is to say, and we're going to have to work to restore what was broken. Just like when I look at the Old Testament narrative and you think about the people of Israel, that was the commitment that people like Daniel and Nehemiah made. They recognized their ancestors did wrong. They said they did wrong, we're going to go this way. But now we are the ones who have to rebuild the walls of the city, and we're committed to doing that. So thinking about, here's some things to prompt, reflection. Think about the GI Bill for veterans. That should actually say World War II veterans. So here's, we think of the benefits, and probably some of us can think of grandparents or parents that maybe benefited from GI Bill during this era. But there were 100,000 African-American vets who applied for the GI benefits that didn't get it. I'm sorry, 100,000 applied, only 20% got GI benefits to go to college. And the reason was most colleges were segregated. So they could get the benefit, but there was no place to go. And at the time, if you look at the history and read the story of the historic black colleges and universities, they were incredibly overcrowded. They were so overcrowded that they actually had to turn people away. As many as 20,000 black vets who had money to go to college could not go to college. Now, where does this become real? I don't know, anybody recognize this theologian, Dr. Carl Ellis, a theologian and author who's written? So his father, Carl Ellis Sr., was a second lieutenant in the Tuskegee Airmen. And I've heard Dr. Ellis tell this story of how his father, an accomplished pilot, got out of the war, wanted to go and fly for the airlines, but was not allowed to be a pilot. They would not hire him because he was black. So his father had to figure out how to go back to school, had to change careers, and as Carl Ellis talks about it today, he said, life would have been a whole lot different if my father, after serving, had not had to figure out how to drop all of those skills that he had and go find a new way of living. So when we think about how do we own the story, sometimes it's a good question to say, so where am I in this? I've often thought, the quick example and parallel in my life that I draw is that I was raised on a farm, and I had the opportunity to be able to raise some cattle that helped me pay for my way go through college. My wife's grandfather was an industrious man and came from a hard scrabble life, but he actually helped pay for 6 of his grandkids to go through college. So when my wife and I got married, we had some college debt like everybody does, but we were in a much different place than we would have been because of the generational help of people before us. And so I often think, okay, that's how I need to own the story, is that I'm in a different place than people like me or people a generation before me. So the last step of the way, so know the story, own the story, and then change the story, is to say, this last point is like, okay, now we have to work to restore it. A couple things that I'll just say about as we think about that is really what's important there is relationships. So the Sankofa journey that I've talked about, that experience, building and investing in those relationships. Second is proximity. Saying, okay, if I find that my life, my work, my church, the things I do, if I am completely separated from people of another race, another culture, I've got to find ways that I become proximate, that I become close to them, that my life begins to intersect. And then the commitment to say, okay, we're gonna stick with this for the long haul, and we're gonna do something. So the last, actually, I'm going to wrap it up there and I will pause there and jump to Q&A, and Brian, let you take it from there. So
Yeah, Carl, so good, so good. So if you have some questions, it's easiest for those online. I can bring the mic to you. So if you got a question, raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic your way. It's a great topic. Yeah.
Really interesting. I'm wondering, do you find that this desire to work towards reconciliation or understanding falls along any political lines? And if so, why do you think that is?
yeah, does it follow along political lines? I would honestly say I don't think so. Or I would say, maybe what I would say is, I don't know that I see, that in my experience, that I've seen either a proclivity or a resistance to it that's stronger in whether left or right or the other, right? So I've seen disinterest in reconciliation and working together on both left and right. And I've seen people interested and committed to it on both left and right. And probably where I would say I've seen the most interest, the most willingness, the most kind of the character and the personal resolve to do it would tend to come from people of faith, which is a good thing, right? I mean, I think that speaks well of us, but.
Good. Yep.
This is going to sound terrible, but when I was a kid, I was told color doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And I've had friends that have been African American in the past and a few now. And color has never been brought up between any of us, although there are issues that they have to deal with that are different than me. But every generation over the years has had terrible things done to them, all through history. And every color, it doesn't matter. Yeah. So why do we have to continue to bring back something from 100 years, 200 years ago? Why can't we start fresh now, being new Christians, thinking of them as somebody I love?
Yep. Yeah, it's a really good question. How do we wrestle with being, this idea of being colorblind? So this is where I think looking back in history and kind of understanding, okay, where did this idea of being colorblind really come from, or how did we get there? Because you're right. Like when I was going through school, when I was going through high school, that was the message, right? Don't see color. So if you think back to the segregation Jim Crow era, and recognize that one of the prevailing issues was the separation of races, right? So you had, if you've seen the pictures, right? A restroom, a drinking fountain, whites, colored, a bus station, whites, colored, right? That was the driving kind of thorn in the flesh that just made this so pervasive, and it's like you can't get away from it. And so, when Dr. King and others were really pressing, in that civil rights issue, the issue was like, can we not see color, right? Let's not see it. Let's look beyond it. And so that was really kind of the message that, as you get right after the civil rights era, 60s and 70s, it was really be blind to color. Now, I think what most people would say is like, okay, yes, we need to we need to get beyond that. And yet history would tell us that there are realities, right? If you think back generationally, our lives are shaped, not just in the moment, but our lives are shaped by our families of origin. Our lives are shaped by the generation before us. Our lives end up being shaped by, if you look at the mapping prejudice and you look at, the redlining that's existed in communities, where people end up living and the resources that are available to them. I think we would say, yes, it's true. Let's not overemphasize color, but let's also recognize that our background, our racial history, our story, our family of origin, actually, it has an impact on us. So I'll show this. I'll show this maybe as an example, and maybe this helps you to frame it and say, okay, how do I navigate this? So my thought is that what we need to do is we need to find ourselves in the middle. So you can go to one extreme, which is to kind of is color blindness, which is saying I don't see, I completely ignore the realities of race and color and all of the personal histories and experiences and backgrounds that might be wound up on it, and kind of discount that, right? And not recognize the impact of that. On the other extreme is what Justin Giboney, who's an African-American scholar and leader of a group called the AND Campaign, and a Christian and a preacher, a minister as well, what he has termed racial essentialism, which is kind of on the other scene, which says everything we look at is essentially a racial issue, right? So when you talk about a disparity or an education outcome, or you talk about a criminal activity, race becomes the essential issue that defines and dominates all of that. And Justin Giboney would say that extreme on the other side is also too far, and that what we need is more of a nuanced place in the middle that says, okay, racial background and systems in the past and patterns might have an impact on it. They might not. We need to ask questions and understand. And it's a middle road of saying, not everything is not entirely and all about race, even if maybe it's got some factors at present, as well as on the other extreme of saying race has no impact and color or background has no impact at all.
Good answer. Yeah.
Just to add on to what you were saying, you have to get past the them and us. Growing up in a Jewish home, it was them and us. We don't think alike, we don't do things alike, and it takes a while to work through that. I know growing up in North Minneapolis, we were racially integrated, and my black friends and us understood each other on that level, because it was always them and us.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Somebody else? Question, comment? Yeah, thank you.
What's your opinion in the Twin Cities should be the disparity in resources between the urban church and the suburban, typically white evangelical church? What should be the responsibility as we think about it missionally? We have millions of dollars, a lot of the white evangelical suburban churches going overseas, while many of the churches are getting turned into mosques right in our own backyard. So what is the responsibility, in your opinion, there?
Yeah, really good question, right? I mean, it kind of gets to this question, this third step along the way, which is, okay, how do we change the story, right? So we know there's disparities, and I could tell you all day long about the economic and disparities I've seen between black churches in our city and white churches in our city. I mean, it's significant. So how do we change it? I would point to these kind of, I think especially the first two about relationships and proximity, meaning invest in the relationship, spend time, be committed, talk about, learn what there's, a white congregation interacting with a black congregation, learn what their story is, what they're doing in ministry, come alongside and partner with them, proximity, spend time with them, and what I think will happen. And I think maybe the commitment piece then is to say, and we're willing to show up, we're willing to invest, but to not do it I think the danger, and sometimes this happens, is that it's kind of in a white savior mentality, right? That you put money there and you just think, okay, and that absolves us, right? So I would say that the issue has to be commitment of saying, okay, there are some disparities, or there's some things that have to be corrected, have to be resolved. It may take a long time, and the goal is not necessarily to transfer resource, because if that's your goal, once you've given a gift or transferred a resource, you feel like, okay, I've done my job, right? I'm done. And yet, if the goal is really about building relationship, building proximity, being on mission, having a goal that you're accomplished together, resource becomes a piece of a common shared goal that you develop together. The key word there is together? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for maybe two more. So who's got a question? Anybody else? All right, Carl, thank you so much for taking the time today. This has been really, really good.
Yeah.
I told you we have 2 giveaways today. So The Warmth of Other Suns is the book that Carl mentioned. And so if you have a birthday in the month of, let's say March, if you're a March birthday, would you stand up for me? Any March birthdays here? Oh, March is not a popular month in Minnesota. Okay, oh, here we go. We do. We have a March? Congratulations, Dan. All right, excellent. And if you asked the last question, that was so good, I'm going to give you the book. I'm just choosing to be, there you go. That was a great question. All right, so, hey, this is a heavy topic. And I love, as you talk about commitment, that the first word you begin with there is relationships. And I just can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to be people who model what it means as followers of Jesus Christ to be bridge builders across all cultures. You know, the Lord has brought the world to the Twin Cities, and we are richer because of that. And we're richer because of our Jewish brothers and sisters and our African American brothers, our Somali friends, and we have the opportunity to make an impact and to build those relationships. So it starts there, and I just really encourage you to maybe take a look at what does my peer group look like. When's the last time I had a lunch with somebody whose story of what it was like to grow up looks radically different from mine? You know, maybe that's you're the kid who grew up in the urban core, and you're like, you just need to hang out with the farm kid a little bit and understand what that was like growing up, or vice versa. But I just really want to encourage you. Next week, our speaker is Moses Ihambe. So Moses grew up in Africa, actually, and was a really good basketball player. And he ended up getting a scholarship and ended up playing in the NBA for a little bit for the New Orleans Pelicans and a number of other teams, and went to college at Oral Roberts University, where he met his wife. And he is a basketball coach for the Minnesota Timberwolves. He's the player development coach for them, but he is much more than a coach. If you talk to Moses, his greatest passion is being a father and being a husband. He and his wife Sarah have 7 children, and their story is an amazing story. But they are one of the most missional couples I've ever met in my life. Moses, in his work life, is about how do I develop players to be better basketball players. And boy, last night I thought we were going to come back in those Warriors, and we were so close. But every one of us have people in our life that we can develop around us. And so next week is all about how do I develop the people around me. And so maybe you've got some basketball fans in your life. Next week could be a great week to invite them to a lunch and learn. But it's way more than about basketball next week. It's about how do we develop those around us. It's going to be an awesome week. And then 2 weeks from today, Lisa Holt will be back with us. She's going to speak about when grief has no relief. We have these times in our life where it just feels like grief upon grief and so much loss. And how do we find relief in those moments in our life? And she is going to be sharing about that as somebody who was a teenager who lost a parent and a parent who lost a teenager. And she just has an amazing perspective. In the month of February, we're going to be taking a look at relationships, specifically between husbands and wives. So 5 Steps to Romantic Love on February 5th or 6th with Bill Harley, Willard Harley, who wrote His Needs, Her Needs, and also wrote a book called 5 Steps to Romantic Love. So he'll be with us that day. We'll give out some copies of that book that day. And he is an amazing communicator. Jim and Patty Robinson on the 13th, Sailing the High Seas of Relationships. And then the 20th, just so you know, Chris and Elizabeth Hardesty will be with us. They are marriage and family therapist, husband and wife team who work at Faithful and True here in Eden Prairie. And they're going to be talking about debunking some of the myths as it relates to sexual intimacy. And we've never talked about that at a Lunch and Learn. That's a great Lunch and Learn. You're going to want to come. You will be awake for that Lunch and Learn. But they are, their story is an amazing story. Faithful and True, if you don't know, is a ministry that works with people who are gripped oftentimes in addiction to pornography. And that's part of their story and what God has done and the healing he's brought in a world where sexuality has been so distorted because of pornography and the scourge of pornography. They're gonna give just some great hints and encouragement to people on that day. So February 20th, really excited about them being with us as well. Okay, thank you for being with us this week. Have a great weekend.